Man in Black. My career as a nurse has taken me to various hospitals, but none were as unsettling as the geriatric hospital where I worked briefly. Located in a remote area, the place had a grim and silent atmosphere, especially during night shifts. The hospital specialized in caring for patients with Alzheimer's, people who often lived in worlds created by their own minds, and I was accustomed to dealing with challenging situations. But nothing could prepare me for what I experienced during those nights. I had just started my shift when I was assigned to care for Lena, a patient known for her restlessness. That night, Lena was more agitated than usual. Every time I entered her room, she gripped my hands with surprising strength for her age and said that a man dressed in black was standing in the corner of the room. She insisted he was watching her with a disturbing smile and that she could hear his whispers. Her roommate, irritated by Lena's constant remarks, had requested the curtain between their beds remain closed, creating a barrier between them. As Lena talked about the man in black, her eyes remained fixed on the dark corner of the room. Despite my experience, the details she provided were disconcerting. I tried to comfort her as best as I could, assuring her she was safe and that I was there to protect her. Gradually, she seemed to relax and eventually fell asleep. I left the room with a small sigh of relief and went to the linen closet to restock my cart. The linen closet was a small, quiet room with a door that was always kept closed to prevent drafts that might disturb the patients. While organizing the linens, I felt something rest on my shoulder, a clear and unmistakable sensation of a hand. I spun around quickly, my heart pounding, but no one was there. My entire body tensed, and the room felt colder. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, playing tricks on me, and returned to my task. A few minutes later, as I turned toward the door to leave, my body froze. Behind the glass pane of the door stood a man dressed in black, his smile chilling me to the bone. His eyes seemed fixed on me, and the smile didn't waver. Before I could react, he vanished, as if he had disintegrated into thin air. I screamed so loudly it echoed through the corridor, waking some of the patients. My colleague ran to the room, alarmed. She found me trembling on the floor and asked what had happened. I tried to explain about the man at the door, but she saw nothing. Despite her efforts to calm me down, my mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Later that night, I went to check on Lena again. She was awake, sitting on her bed with wide eyes. As soon as I entered, she asked, "You saw him, didn't you?" I swallowed hard and asked how she knew. Lena fixed her gaze on me and said, "He smiles at you when he knows you can see him too." My legs felt weak, and before I could say anything, Lena began screaming, begging to leave the room. Other nurses rushed in to help calm her, and I requested an immediate transfer to another unit. The next morning, I resigned. I told my supervisor the job was unsustainable for me, but didn't go into details about what had happened. To this day, I think about that night. I've never been diagnosed with any psychological conditions or had any history of hallucinations. The experience was so vivid, so real, that it's impossible to ignore. Whatever happened that night left a permanent mark on me. Echoes in the hallway. During a public health emergency, I accepted a temporary contract at a decommissioned hospital repurposed as a triage center. Located in an isolated area, the building had been closed for years and hastily reopened to handle the surge of patients. The hallways were long, cold, and lit by flickering fluorescent lights, creating an unsettling environment for anyone on the night shift. From my first shift, something about the place felt off. There was a heavy energy that intensified in the silence of the early hours. My night shift started at 8 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. During the night, the usual sounds of a bustling hospital were replaced by an eerie stillness, broken only by the footsteps of the few staff on duty. That night I was alone on the upper floor, organizing patient files and checking equipment. The other nurses were downstairs, and only one patient was admitted, sleeping in a distant room. Around midnight, while updating documents in the monitoring room, I heard footsteps coming from the main hallway. The sound was rhythmic, as if someone was walking deliberately. I stood up and went to the door but saw no one. The sound continued, now farther away, heading to the opposite end of the floor. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to investigate, thinking it might be a colleague. Walked down the hallway, illuminating the walls with my flashlight, but there was no sign of anyone. Reaching the end of the hallway, a shiver ran down my spine. The temperature seemed to drop abruptly, and a faint, dragging sound echoed from a room to the left. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside, but the room was empty. In the corner, a wheelchair sat slightly tilted, as if someone had just pushed it. A cold breeze swept through the hallway, slamming the door shut with a loud bang, making my heart race. I quickly returned to the monitoring room, but something had changed. One of the camera screens showed movement in the hallway near the patient's room. It was a shadow sliding along the walls with no discernible body attached to it. I froze for a few seconds before picking up the phone to call one of the nurses downstairs. No one answered. I decided to check on the patient to ensure she was okay. As I approached the room, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The hallway seemed darker than before, as if the lights were failing deliberately. Entering the room, I found the patient awake, staring at the window. I asked if she was all right, and she replied in a trembling voice, "You saw it too, didn't you?" My blood ran cold, but I tried to remain calm. I asked what she meant, and she simply pointed to the dark corner of the room. When I shone my flashlight on the corner, I saw nothing, but the air there felt denser, almost suffocating. The patient began murmuring about the shadow that walks, and my heart raced even faster. I decided to move her to another room closer to the stairs so she'd be near other staff. As I helped her up, a cold gust swept past me, followed by the sound of quick footsteps in the hallway. I rushed to leave with the patient. As we walked down the hallway, the lights flickered uncontrollably. Looking back, I briefly saw a tall, indistinct figure at the end of the corridor. It was standing still, but the sensation that it was following us was almost unbearable. I ran to the lower floor, finding my colleagues, who looked bewildered by my terrified expression. I explained what had happened, but they were skeptical. One nurse volunteered to go upstairs with me to check. When we arrived, everything was strangely calm. The hallway was well lit, and there was no sign of the shadow or the earlier events. I felt as if I were losing my sanity. That same night, as I tried to collect myself in the break room, another nurse rushed in, saying something strange had happened with the monitors. The cameras were picking up inexplicable movements in the empty hallways. I decided I couldn't stay in that position. I requested the transfer the next day, but the echoes of that night remain vivid in my memory. A reminder that not everything can be explained. The presence in the ICU, At the hospital where I worked for 5 years, there were always rumors about the ICU on the third floor. Many colleagues avoided talking about it, but the stories persisted. Patients often reported seeing a woman in a white dress sitting in the lounge chairs or walking through the corridors. Nurses spoke of equipment turning on by itself, or monitors registering movements in empty rooms. Although I had never experienced anything directly, I always felt an inexplicable discomfort whenever I had to go up to the third floor, especially at night. One night, everything changed. My shift started like any other. I was on duty with only one other nurse, Jose, and we were tasked with monitoring the patients in the ICU. The floor was eerily silent, something unusual for a hospital. There were 4 patients admitted, all sedated or deeply asleep. The corridor lights flickered occasionally, but that was something we had learned to ignore. Shortly after midnight, I noticed something strange on the monitor for room 307. The patient, who was sedated and connected to a ventilator, showed a sudden spike in heart activity, as if moving. I went to check, but upon entering the room, everything was quiet and the vitals had stabilized. I inspected the cables and equipment. Everything seemed normal. As I turned to leave, a chill ran up my spine. The chair in the corner of the room, which I was sure had been empty, now appeared slightly tilted, as if someone had just stood up. I returned quickly to the monitoring station and told Jose what had happened. He laughed, saying it was probably just my exhaustion getting the better of me. While we were talking, the alarm in room 309 went off. We ran there, but again, the patient was stable, and there was nothing wrong with the devices. That's when I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The window in the room was completely fogged up, and there was a handprint on the glass, as if someone had pressed their palm against it from the inside. I pointed it out to Jose, but he muttered something about humidity before quickly leaving the room. Determined to find an explanation, I decided to review the security footage. What I saw made my heart stop. A shadow moved through the hallway, pausing briefly outside room 309 before vanishing. The figure had no clear features, but appeared tall and fluid, as if not entirely solid. I called Jose to see, but he grew visibly uncomfortable and insisted he didn't want to get involved. Around 2 a.m., as I made my rounds, I felt a presence. It was as if someone was watching me, but every time I looked back, the corridor was empty. Passing by room 311, I heard a whisper. I stopped, thinking the patient might be awake, but they were sedated and sound asleep. The whisper continued, low and indistinct, coming from the corner of the room where a small table stood. Shining my flashlight into the corner, I saw nothing, but the sound stopped immediately. I decided to finish my rounds as quickly as possible. When I returned to the monitoring station, I found Jose pale, staring at the monitors. I asked what was wrong, and he pointed to the screen for room 303. There, in the chair beside the bed, was a woman dressed in white. Her long hair obscured her face, and she sat perfectly still, as if watching the patient. We ran to the room, but when we opened the door, the chair was empty. From that moment on, we were both on edge. We decided to stay together for the rest of the shift, refusing to enter any rooms alone. But the activity didn't stop. The corridor lights began flickering erratically, and the monitors in several rooms started beeping without reason. It was as if the entire floor had come alive, trying to drive us out. When the shift finally ended, I swore I would never work on that floor again. I requested a transfer that same week and avoided the third floor from then on. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night, but the memory of the woman in white still haunts me, especially when I find myself alone in an empty corridor.